And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Thursday, January 20th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories and others can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com. And here today we're going to go to Shoshone Bannock, correspondent for IndianCountryTV.com. He's reporting from Idaho today. And we're going to talk with Mark Trahant a little bit about the repeal of the Health Care Act that occurred in Congress, the House of Representatives in Congress yesterday on January 19th, and how that might impact the Indian Health Care Improvement Act. Mark Trahant, we're in another day and another time, and healthcare has been passed, and now it's been repealed in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., and you've certainly kept an eye on this whole process. Can you give us a little update about what you see going on here, and what were the dynamics of the vote?
Well, the vote pretty much was as expected. Virtually all of the Democrats, except for three who voted against health care last time, voted to keep the current law, and all of the Republicans voted to overturn it. This is where it starts to get complicated, though. In the Senate, Harry Reid, the majority leader, has said he doesn't even need to take it up. There's no rule that forces him to do so. So it's probably not even going to get a hearing, let alone a vote, which infuriates the Republicans to no end. Meanwhile, the real action's on the money. And for Indian health system, this is where it gets really interesting. One of the provisions of healthcare reform that the Republicans can't touch is increasing the eligibility of Medicaid to 133% of federal poverty level, which, and it depends where you're at, what that number is, but it's on the reservation going to include a great number of people. So those folks are automatically now qualified for Medicaid. And the state can't say no, the federal government can't say no. This should put them on the books. And that money is all automatic. There's nothing the Republican Congress can do about it.
It's an adjustment to the qualifications. Is that what you're saying? Why it's something it's an adjustment to the index or something like that, rather than a piece of legislation guided by a yes or no vote on the Health Care Act.
Right. It's actually in the Health Care Act, but they didn't repeal it. They only had one house say we want to repeal it. So that's the law of the land, the Health Care Act.
And let me my understanding, there's a lot of money to do the outreach to try to bring those people into the system based on the new law.
Right. That's going to be a little trickier. Anything that's an appropriated dollar, they're going to fight over. Anything that's an entitlement is automatic. The Medicaid money, the money for children's health insurance, those are automatic. But where you'll really see some knockdown, drag-out fights is over the actual appropriations. Now, both houses have to agree. So at some point, they either shut the government down or they come to some sort of resolution between the House and the Senate about what that number ought to be.
Is health insurance for congressional Republicans a mandate, or is that a budgetary issue?
It's a budgetary issue, and the Democrats have been trying to put them on the spot and saying, boy, you're taking these benefits away from other people. Why don't you give them up? Why should you get this Cadillac health plan when so many folks are uninsured? And the Republicans haven't bit so far.
Well, I think that a lot of people out in public are asking that same questions too. Why are public servants allowed to have everything that they want, and yet some of the poorest people in the community, and really sometimes it's not the poorest people, it's kind of the people in the middle class that seem to fund things and make too much money to get the kinds of services. Our new representative that replaced Congressman Dave Obey, who had been there for years and was a power horse. Representative Sean Duffy, our Wisconsin, said he wanted to see new ideas before voting for repeal, but on the House floor Wednesday morning, he gave an impassioned, figure-jabbing speech saying he would vote for repeal, and he did. So is this kind of like reading the Constitution on the floor of Congress, where some Republicans had never read the Constitution before, says we need to read it out there, discovered that the Constitution actually said some things that they didn't agree with? I mean, is it symbolic that
It's
they've done
symbolic,
this? Because they know they're
but
not going to get the president to sign this unless there's
right.
overwhelming support in the Senate on both sides of the aisle, right?
Even then he wouldn't sign it.
Right.
um, I'm glad you brought up the Constitution because I think that's a really illustrate the differences between how people think right now. The Republicans read the Constitution. They take a very literal view of the Constitution. What it says, nothing more. And Democrats tend to see the Constitution as metaphor, that it's a document about how we live today and what we take from that document about how we construct a better society. And those two points of view don't reconcile. I mean, they're very different worldviews. And I think that's part of the problem we have right now. Take, for example, treaties. I mean, you could see Republicans arguing that the Indian health promise is basically a doctor on the reservation. Well, we all know that it's long been past that it's not just a doctor on the reservation.
Well, an economic development on the reservation is a blacksmith.
Exactly.
According to the treaties. But there's
right,
also
if you're going to be literal.
And there's some things in those treaties that haven't ever been recognized that ought to be. I mean, that's part of the political question that's come up. The people want to read these documents literally. The courts look at them and say, no, you got to kind of adjust for modern society. So the reservation of hunting and treaty rights doesn't mean you reserved them all, but only your half. Because we got to share them. A new concept that we got to share them between the people who have now come here and modernized. So the Constitution is fluid in those cases where people want it to be, and it's not. So if I read the Constitution, Mark, and I got to admit that I haven't read it in some time, I could find some things in there and say, it doesn't say that we have a right to declare against war against Iraq in 2001 or whenever it is, because it's not in here. There's no authorizing capability.
It's kind of what, like what Shakespeare said about the Bible. Shakespeare wrote, "The devil can cite scriptures for his own purpose." I mean, you can find anything in there.
Right, indeed. And does this vote do anything to bring people together? I mean, again, the question is okay, the Republicans have now jammed this repeal. The first order of business is repealing it, knowing that the president wouldn't sign it, knowing that it's not likely that the Senate's even going to pick it up. Is that got anything to do with trying to do business for the people in a good way that considers both sides of the aisle and reconciliation and all these other things that people keep talking about, coming together and legislating together and crossing the aisle to do things? Or is this a Tea Party thing that where the Tea Parties came in and this is what they want, and the Republican Party's got to give something to the Tea Party group in order to appease them? Is that what they got yesterday?
I think it's an open question, and I'll be generous for a minute and give them the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps they had to do this for the Tea Party, and this is the end of it. But the question is, what happens now? Do they start to look for constructive solutions, particularly on healthcare? And I've raised this as an example before. One that both Democrats and Republicans ought to agree on is right now, under the law, small businesses, 1, 2, 3, 4 people, have to fill out 1099 forms for any expenditure over a few $100s. That's going to be a terrible burden to do. And you can imagine Indian Country Communications having to do that for freelancers. Well, that's something there ought to be agreement on. It ought to not be a big deal. But if they can even get the two sides together to say, let's fix this one part of the bill, that will be, I think, very telling.
Right. And there's probably 50 things that can be tweaked in it, and I agree. There's going to be some things that got passed in this voluminous document, hundreds of pages, thousands of pages, and were changed as it evolved along. That small businesses, and I mean, you'd think the Republicans and Democrats could both sit down and say, look, we should exempt businesses that have less than 20 employees or whatever it is, find some threshold kind of a thing. Especially for Indian country, because a lot of the businesses are either tribally owned or they're small mom and pop businesses, and we don't need any more regulations on them.
I totally agree.
How does this repeal thing, like you says, it's sort of symbolic. It may not go anywhere, but on the budget fight, there's not. They were talking about authorizations to build new clinics and those kinds of things. Are those things in jeopardy at this point on the reservation level?
I think funding of that nature is in jeopardy. They and your representative from Wisconsin is the one that holds the cards, Paul Ryan. They took away the normal power of appropriations subcommittee chairs. And normally those appropriation subcommittee chairs had really great latitude about what to spend money on. Now Paul Ryan is going to set the number, and that will be a hard cap. And anything they want to spend has to be below that cap. So he's talking about cutting $50 to $100 billion out of the budget. We're halfway into the budget year. I mean, that really, to get those kind of numbers, we're talking about 25% cuts in existing programs. I don't think they're going to get them. I don't think they'll get anything near that, but that's pretty extraordinary.
Well, it sounds like it because it almost sounds like some programs would have to be brought to an end if you're talking about deep budget cuts and we're halfway through the fiscal year. It means that literally there may not be any money to keep operating, which you talk about too on the budget deficit issue. This thing is going to come to a point where they're either going to cap it and not reauthorize any further expenditures, which means that they got to get the cuts from somewhere else, or they got raised taxes.
Right.
Where are we headed with this? To me, it sounds like we're headed toward kind of a situation where there's going to be some kind of a meltdown somewhere as people force their hand.
Will the adults be in charge or the Tea Party animals? I mean, that really is the test coming ahead.
Where does Indian country fall into this whole argument? Do we see the tribal chairmen beginning to posture on positions and things like that? Are they going to be able to protect their back?
So far, it seems to me that most of Indian country is pretty much pushing as business as usual. They had meetings, for example, last week with HHS about consultation and how to structure Indian Healthcare Improvement Act situations. There was an invitation to the new Republican majority, and they didn't show up. And so that tells me that they're not even talking to each other, and that's something to be of concern. Now, one thing that folks have said is we can rely on our friends. And one huge friend now is Don Young, who's the chairman of the new Native American Committee in the House. But given the way they've constructed the spending with Paul Ryan, that I'm not sure will be enough.
Well, it's going to be interesting. Where's the next showdown? What do you see coming here? I mean, you said the money, but is there anything else in the hopper? So far, we've had a lot of things that seem highly symbolic, galloping out the gate, but horses seem to be running in circles rather than moving forward right at the moment.
Well, one of the things on the list that just astounds me is the new House Committee on Investigations, which is chaired by Darrell Issa of California, has put together a list of the top 10 things they want to investigate the Obama administration on, ranging from TARP to some pretty normal things. Number 10 on the list is the president's birth certificate.
I was just going to ask about that.
That tells you they're in loony bin land.
Yeah, well, listen, it's like pretty soon, aren't you going to have to carry your birth certificate along with you in case you get stopped?
That's right. He'd probably carry his crow one.
Yeah, they're not only going to want a green card, but they want to know whether or not you're alive or not. So you got to have your certificate of live birth. Well, we're going to watch where this goes. It seems to be kind of the opium salvo in a situation here. Keep in touch with us, all right? Are you going back to D.C. in the near future, as far as you know?
No, next 2 months I'll be here on the campus at the University of Idaho. I'm editor in residence,
Right.
but after March I will be.
And is there anything lively in politics down there in Utah at all that you can report?
Idaho?
Idaho, excuse me, Idaho. I mean, yeah, that's right. Utah, Idaho, somewhere out west. I'm sorry. In the world of internet, we better place that within the United States because there are people all over the country working on this. Well, we'll keep in touch with you. Keep an eye on the the politics of D.C. and the legislation, especially on Indian affairs, and we'll keep in touch with you and get your opinion on some of this stuff in the future.
Sounds good, Paul.
Thanks, Mark. And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian country on this edition of the Native News Update. Miigwech for joining with us. Come back again soon.